QSO Today, episode 372, Andy Mitchell, VA3CW. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through the in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I want to take a moment to thank Elwood Downey, WB0OEW, for funding the transcriptions of two recent podcasts, episode 366 with Jim Condon, AD4YM, and episode 371, Brian Callahan, AD2BA. Elwood has sponsored many of the transcripts that we have on the QSO Today website and has been a great supporter of the podcast for many years. Thanks, Elwood. Andy Mitchell, VA3CW, as an 11-year-old Boy Scout, participated with his small troop in Boy Scout Jamboree on the air in 1974. This exposure changed the course of Andy's life, profession, and interests. Getting on the air and working DX are the simple ham radio pastimes that contribute to his free time enjoyment of amateur radio. VA3CW is my QSO Today. VA3CW, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Andy?
4Z1UG, this is VA3CW. How are you doing, Eric?
I'm great, Andy. Thank you. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Eric, I'm going to have to dust off some cobwebs. It was quite a while ago, at least by my calendar. This goes back to 1974, and it's kind of timely for me. This weekend is Jamboree on the air for Boy Scouts, and that's where I got my start. I was a member of a local Boy Scout troop, and back in those days, there were lots of activities for merit badges and so forth. Jamboree on the air sounded interesting, but wasn't necessarily something that I was sure I was going to spend a lot of time at. And my visit to Jamboree on the air was the start into amateur radio for me, and a whole lot more.
So let's go back a little bit farther. Did you have a technical interest in electronics and radio even before Jamboree on the air?
Well, yes and no. My father worked for the telephone company, so I was exposed to a certain extent to electricity and gadgetry. So I might have messed with adding an extra phone in the house or playing with ringers or so forth. My interest prior to that was more centric around photography, and that had taken up a good deal of the rec room at the time.
And what was the hometown?
My hometown is a small place called Bracebridge. It's about a 2-hour drive north of Toronto, and interestingly enough, it sits directly on the 45th parallel.
And we don't call states in Canada states, we call them...
They're provinces.
Provinces. Bracebridge is in which province?
Bracebridge is in Ontario, so that makes me a VE3 or a VA3.
So your father worked for the telephone company, and was that like a Bell system? Was it like Bell Telephone of Canada or something in those days?
Exactly. So it would have been Bell Telephone Company of Canada at that point in time, very much similar to what was going on south of the border, part of the Bell system.
And so you had some remnants of telephone handsets and things like that might have dropped off the truck?
Bits and pieces that fell off the truck, or science experiments, projects for school. But it wasn't something that at that point in time necessarily turned my crank. I would reflect back to my buddy and I in a pup tent in the backyard, and I'd run an extension cord out of the house, and we thought, we'll take this old radio and we'll push tubes into it, and we'll listen to some AM stations out in the tent. No real understanding of electronics at that point in time. I think the the outcome of that was a hot chassis and a good zap, and that was the end of the electronics interest, if there was any, for a year or two.
So then what happened at the Jamboree on the Air in 1974? What was the ignition?
So I think probably a half dozen of us showed up at a local amateur's home. I knew the fellow, Charlie. He's a silent key now. His call at the time was VA3CW. Charlie was a technician in a local television repair shop. Mr. Nurnberg, as I would have known him, was a family friend, but again, didn't know too much about the hobby or what he did. All I knew was if we went past his house, he had some interesting antennas in his backyard. When I showed up there with the other fellows, I think I was immediately taken by the amount of equipment that he had in his basement. It's like, wow, this guy is pretty serious about what he's doing. So I spent a few minutes looking around, but I think what caught me right away was I was hearing voices from that radio, and I was hearing people tell Charlie and the other scouts in the room where they were from. They were some guys our age, and we were hearing from scouts in various places in the U.S. I was, oh, that's pretty interesting. You know, we've seen walkie-talkies and radios and cars and trucks, but generally we're not hearing people our own age speaking from places in the U.S. What turned out to be a session that was supposed to be an hour or two for us was, for me, 4 hours. And my parents calling and wondering where I was. And Charlie had spent some extra time, and we'd made some extra contacts. And it's like, this might be something I'm interested in.
Were there other students or other scouts there that also stayed, that showed an interest like you?
No, and that's one of those awkward moments. You know, your buddies have left, and what makes me different that I want to stay around and spend some time with this.
So then what happened after that? Did Charlie become your mentor?
Yeah, here's an interesting piece. At the same point in time, of our scoutmaster, John Purchase, who at the time was V3BPJ. Actually, he wasn't V3BPJ at that time. He was interested in amateur radio, and he was studying for his ticket. He ultimately became V3BPJ, but he was our scoutmaster. He was also a teacher. He was an out-of-classroom education teacher. And just had opportunity to chat with him afterwards. And he said, "What did you think of this?" I said, This is pretty interesting. I like that. I'd like to do it again. And you realize that if this is something that you would be interested in, you would have to you'd have to learn some more electronics. You'd have to learn Morse code, rules and regulations. There's a license for all of this. It's a bit of a study. And I thought about that, and I said, yeah, I think I could do that. Now, I really had no concept of what was involved at the time, and the licensing standards in Canada weren't particularly appealing to a younger group. At the time, you were required to draw schematic diagrams of a superhet receiver, a transmitter, power supply, filters, you name it. You were also required to send and receive CW at 10 words per minute. And typically at that point in time, in either an examiner or tape, and I think you weren't permitted any more than 3 errors at that. So it was 3-minute copy at 10 words per minute. Oral examination on rules and regulations, it was it was a bit of a barrier to entry. And prior to that, there was a restriction that you needed to be 16 years of age or older. That restriction had been taken away about the time that I was ready to go with it.
So John, he actually made the presentation to you, and you accepted. What happened after that? Was there a course, or did you take this as a self-study project or a project that you did with John?
It was, I think, Eric, a formative time for amateur radio in that community. The town itself only had about 3,600 in population, and Charlie and maybe 3 or 4 other hams resided in the community. There was no formal club per se. There was some discussion with respect to having an FM repeater. A lot of what went on in the community was just over breakfast or coffee or in someone's basement. So in order to move ahead with licensing, what John did for me was he facilitated the mentoring. So in terms of general understanding of amateur radio, that stuff went to Charlie. Jim, V3HWK, was also a mentor. Jim, interestingly enough, was also a television repair tech at a competing business to Charlie. Jim gave me my theory. He gave me the support for the theory. And then I was introduced to Fred, V3BG, Fred Hale, who is also a silent key. And Fred spent the time with me to understand CW and perfect something that later on in the hobby became pretty important to me. So 3 mentors altogether, and about a year later where I started into the exam phase.
And what level did you go after first? Did you go after the first level of the amateur radio license in Canada, which is its equivalent, the novice license in America?
At the time, no. I would say the Canadian license structure was pretty simple. You were either an amateur or an advanced amateur. And the amateur requirement was the schematic diagrams, radio theory, regulations, and CW at 10 words a minute. That gave you HF privileges. However, you were restricted to CW operation only below 30 megahertz. Anything above 30 megahertz, you could pretty much do as you wished. No restrictions on ERP, or pardon me, on power output. Simply, the restriction was you couldn't operate phone below 30. If after 6 months you could demonstrate to a radio inspector that you had been active, so you display your paper log to the radio inspector, you might be granted permission to operate phone on 10 meters only. So there's a bit of an incentive to do some upgrading there. You were going to earn your stripes, so to speak, in CW first. So the amateur ticket gave you those privileges to start with, the endorsement for 10-meter phone, and then you pursued the advanced amateur ticket, which was 15 words per minute and some advanced theory that got into to sideband and FM. So my first crack at it was back in 1975, and I did the amateur ticket, and then I did the endorsement.
Okay, so that was 1975. How old were you?
I had just turned 13 when I got my ticket.
Is the call sign that you have now, which is VA3CW, was that the call sign that you received then?
No, the first call sign that I received was VE3EKF, Echo Kilo Fox. It was a bit of a mouthful, but it worked okay on CW.
Now, is there a difference between a VE and a VA in terms of, can you recognize a license class of a Canadian amateur from his call sign?
No, in fact, you can't. The VA prefix came out not all that long ago, but I think it's getting on close to 20 years back, where the VE prefix had become exhausted in certain provinces. So this was kind of a relief thing. Prior to that, you could be pretty certain that the only folks that were carrying 2-letter calls were folks that had their advanced tickets. and that was a requirement early on. But the VA calls came out, that kind of went by the wayside.
And now this message from ICOM America. Contest remotely or from the comfort of your home. You heard that right. The 4 ICOM rigs that I will discuss in this message can be remotely controlled using the optional RSBA1 software. And these days, given the high electronic noise and HOA restrictions, you might want to remotely operate your ICOM rig in a mountain cabin or rural parcel from anywhere in the world over the Internet. Now you can. ICOM has the perfect base station ready for remote control action. The ICOM IC7851, IC9700, IC7610, and the IC7300 SDR transceivers are top of the line and are the first choice for contesters, DXers across the globe. The ICOM IC7851 is HF excellence unparalleled and gives you a new window into the RF world. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it is truly the pinnacle of HF transceiver perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, a high-resolution spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity with both USB and Ethernet connectivity, SD memory card slot. Create your own band opening with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy: faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. It has a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, dual digicell. Both the ICOM IC9700 and the IC7610 have Ethernet connections on their back panels to allow direct connection to your router without a server PC for remote control using the RSBA1 software. The ICOM IC7300 changed the way that entry-level HF is designed. This high-performance innovative HF transceiver with its compact design will far exceed your expectations. RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, SD memory card slot. Remote control can be made using a small computer or Raspberry Pi using the RSBA1 remote control software. This is amazing. So even if you live in an HOA or in the center of the city, where ham radio operation may not be ideal, ICOM has a remote base station solution with just the right rig to fit your requirements and budget. Please, when you visit your favorite dealer to purchase your ICOM rig, be sure to tell that dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now, back to our QSO. Now we have, and it could be for a number of reasons. It could be that the tests now are a little bit easier in the States. It could be that the kids are much smarter in the States now than they were when we were kids. But 13 years old at the time seemed to be, pretty young for a ham. How were you received by the amateur radio community in your area as a 13-year-old ham?
In the community, I was really supported. There were a lot of great hams in and around the province that I had an opportunity to bump into. I was taken by the local fellows, my mentors, to a couple of ham fests, and got to know some people on the air through 2-meter FM, either simplex or through repeaters. And it was a lot of fun, a lot of encouragement, and a couple of fellows that drove between Toronto and North Bay. At the time, it was about a 4-hour drive. These guys would stop in, have coffee, and maybe bring me something from the junk box or from the surplus store in Toronto, which was quite welcome. For experimentation, I was pretty restricted in terms of what I could lay my hands on. Maybe some stuff from shop at school, or taking an old TV chassis apart. So when I get something from someone's junk box from out of town, it was a good day.
How supportive were your parents to your new amateur radio hobby?
Well, that was kind of an interesting conversation too, because I'd been playing about in photography, and I was more interested in what you could do in the darkroom necessarily than what you could do artistically with a camera. And in fact, I was not too good in terms of the eye through the camera, but I could do some pretty cool stuff in the darkroom. And I had put some stuff together. I'd made some investment with paper route money, and I've taken up most of the rec room. So when I declared that I was done with that, I was met with some surprise. Like, well, what are you going to do with all that stuff? What's happening in the rec room? And I'll sell this stuff. I'm out of it. I enjoyed it. It was great. And Dad, can I have some space on the other side of the basement in the workshop area? Because rec room wasn't going to be a good place to set up a ham shack. I needed it, access to the outside, and I needed some bench.
What was the first rig?
First rig, again, here's some super support from the community. One of my dad's colleagues was a ham who'd become inactive, quite busy at work, young family, put his stuff up. I had a Hallicrafters SX110, an ICO 720, and an ICO 722 outboard VFO. The antennas were kind of interesting back in the day. We had an old cable TV site at the end of our street, and it was on a high rise of land. And the cable TV technology in the day was, because we were so far away from major urban centers like Toronto or Buffalo, was you built a big parabolic, so took a number of towers, built a parabolic shape, and then strung some annealed aluminum wire in between those things, and then had an array pointed into the parabolic. And with that, you could have a head end for cable TV. Well, with the advent of microwave backhaul and the ability to put up a taller tower, the cable TV company decided that they would wreck that parabolic. Wow, what a heyday. So again, small community. I knew the owner of the cable TV site, and I approached him and I said, hey, do you think I could nab some tower and maybe some bits and pieces? And he was, yeah, by all means, help yourself. Certainly the value of scrap metal in those days was a little bit different than it is today. I came home with hardline. I came home with RG11, RG6 coax. Everything was 75 ohms. I learned about that a little bit later. A bunch of aluminum wire, and I was able to fab up some dipoles. And that was about the extent of my antenna collection at the time. I begged my father to allow me to attach the tower, which was at that point in time three sections of tower against the back of the garage, and that was what I had. What I quickly learned was 75 ohm coax, that water-filled old RG59, RG6, it wasn't a particularly good feed line. And although try as I might, the antenna situation was not as good as I had hoped. So a little more support from the mentors, and we designed some new dipoles, but I ran out of space. I needed something for 75 and 80 meters. My dad approached the property manager at the hospital that was behind our home and asked if we could attach an antenna to the end of the hospital as well. So,
and how did that work? Did they agree?
Oh, they agreed, absolutely. The hospital custodian
Small town advantage.
Small town advantage. The hospital custodian was on the roof the next day helping me haul up the the leg of the one dipole.
Well, it sounds to me like you got a really nice start with the support of your community. How did it go after that? I mean, did amateur radio then inspire you to pursue an education that was technical?
That's a good piece to examine. So I would say at that point that I had invested some time in studying and received my license and started to enjoy the hobby. I was rolling around to having to do course selection for high school, and I had spoken with the guidance counselor at public school. These are the courses I'd like to take, and of course I'd like to take electrical or electronics. So we had the opportunity to go into the high school and chat with our teachers about the programs that we were going to enroll in. I had a chance to chat with the shop teacher, express my interest in electronics. And he said, you know what, based on what you know, you should probably just not take grade 9 electrical. You should just ask to be put into the grade 10 electronics class. You'll find that a lot more interesting. So that's in fact what I did. That opened up some doors for me in high school because it created some spares where I could invest in other subjects. And as I went through high school, what I gathered from my electronics necessary for my ticket and through high school, I decided I might just like a career in technology. So upon graduation, I set out to community college for 3 years to study electronics technology.
So in Canada, community colleges aren't 2 years, they're 3 years, and you end up with an associate's or BA degree. What kind of certificate do you get from a 3-year college?
3-year community college at the time was a diploma of, so this would be diploma of technology in electronics engineering.
And where did that take you?
Kind of an interesting story once again. So amateur radio never being too far out of mind, we had some on-campus recruiting taking place, and one of the recruiters was the Federal Department of Communication, Government of Canada, Federal Department of Communications. And lo and behold, they were recruiting for a radio inspector. Wow, how fortuitous. This is exactly what I want to do. So I went through that process and I accepted a letter of employment or an offer of employment from Department of Communications. I was all set to start in the big city and received a phone call one morning from one of the professors at the college, and he said, we'd like you to go on a tour of a defense electronics company in Toronto that was Litton Systems. And well, why would I do that? You know, I'm going to be off to work in a couple of weeks, and they're really not keen on spending a day in Toronto. Thanks. Well, if you'd like to graduate, if you'd like your diploma, you will need to go down there. And 6 or 8 of us went down, and we toured the Litton Systems plant just outside of Toronto. And as we were leaving, we were corralled into a room and asked to fill out some paperwork. And I thought, this is kind of odd. I mean, we've already had the tour, and we already did our security clearance to enter the building. What are we doing now? Within half an hour, there were offers of employment on the table in front of all of us, and I've already got employment with the Department of Communications, but thanks anyway. It became a salary discussion at that point in time, and I was pretty impressed. The placement rate of college graduates at the time in technology was pretty high, and in fact, the skill set was in demand. I was again pleasantly surprised when I walked out of there. I got a whole lot more money than I was going to get as a radio inspector. So that's where I headed.
So you had to call the Federal Department of Communications and tell them that you weren't going to take their job?
Yeah, thanks, but no thanks. And the person that I called was quite understanding. The public service employers or employees in Canada were to an extent unionized, and the pay structure was pretty inflexible. Whereas working for private sector, that was the first thing I realized. Pay structures are a lot more flexible.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Now, you mentioned earlier that you've known Michael Walker, VA3MW, who is a frequent contributor to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. He's been a guest on the QSO Today podcast, and he's a co-host of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. You and Michael have been friends for 46 years. Is he paralleling in this universe at the same time that you are?
To an extent, had a bit of a parallel universe as well. Mike pursued employment, education and employment and technology as well, and he and I periodically cross paths on the air. Mike lived a couple of hours north of where I did, so our communication was typically either on 2-meter FM or on HF. But our paths would cross again as we both wound up moving into the Greater Toronto area to go to work. And when we did, we found each other in person again, working on the local 2-meter FM repeater, providing some technical support and some hands-on involvement with that group.
Well, I guess I was making some improper inferences. Lytton Systems may be a part of the Lytton that's also in the San Fernando Valley of California. And I remember the valley growing up, that it was heavily into defense and rocketry and guidance systems and all that kind of stuff. Was that the direction that your career with Lytton took?
Yeah, in fact, my employment with Lytton Systems Canada was specifically associated with their guidance products, and also with the electronics for the F-18 for the U.S. Navy for the cockpit.
See, Michael talks obviously about his NORAD experience, so I thought perhaps he and you were maybe in the same contractor. It's interesting, actually, that I don't know anything about Canada. I've been to Canada both times when it snowed, and had an opportunity to see what snow is like in Canada as I'm flying in and out, on the one hand. On the other hand, I wasn't really aware that American defense contractors were actually working in Canada. I guess it shouldn't surprise me, but it's interesting that was the case. How long were you at Lytton?
I stayed with Lytton only a few years, 3 or 4 years, and largely my interest started to head back to communications. So I learned an awful lot from my years at Lytton. I had exposure to some pretty cool technology, access to some pretty cool test equipment and computing capabilities, and kind of rounded out my knowledge, and I was able to take some of that back into amateur radio. But it was really communications that was of interest to me. I had an opportunity at that point in time to move to Canada's National Railway for passenger service via rail, and the role I took on there was I was building a telecom network in Ontario to support that, and as well radio communications. So this was something that appealed to me, and the hours are a little bit better, the pay was a little bit better, and I spent a couple of years in there.
And during this period of time, were you an active amateur radio operator?
Yes. Once I was out of school and on my own into an apartment in Toronto, I had every opportunity to get on the air, and was monkeying about with what I could do on the balcony in terms of antennas. And
what was your favorite operating mode in those days?
In those days, sunspot cycle was still pretty favorable, and I rather enjoyed what you could do on 10 meters with next to nothing in terms of an antenna. So sideband or CW, and just being able to DX pretty much anywhere, any time of the day. That was a bit of a fascination for me then. The other thing that was interesting was our local repeater was in fact quite a technical marvel, and I know Mike can attest to that. The control system was based on a Motorola 6809. Prior to that, it was old ECL and TTL logic, very discrete logic control. But a group of us had gotten together and worked on the 6809 based controller. We hauled telemetry out of the site, which was a good 40 miles from where I lived, over UHF. Put together a modem and an old GE terminette to gain access to the console remotely. That was another very interesting piece of amateur activity in the day.
Oh, I bet it was. I remember the evolution of repeater control systems from relays to TTL to CMOS to microprocessors. So it sounds to me like you got to be there right as that evolution was going on. It's my understanding, because Mike has mentioned this to me, that this system in Toronto was also linked out of the Toronto area?
Yeah, there was considerable RF linking from V3 RPT. And that linking went across Lake Ontario into to Buffalo. It extended into Northern Ontario. These links were full duplex UHF, or a couple of them we had on 220. And in the day, that was quite an impressive feat. DTMF, obviously, to control the linking. It served a good purpose in terms of weather spotting in the day. The CanWarn network used that extensively, and I think that repeater hub system also generated a lot of activity in other smaller communities who put repeaters up and connected into them.
So the V3 RPT became kind of this hub for rural and local repeaters to be connected together, so you had this wide area system that worked across most of the province?
Yeah, that's pretty much it, Eric. And south of the border, the Buffalo Amateur Radio Repeater Association also built a similar network that extended across the northern part of the state of New York. So you could tandem up a couple of links and be talking from Northern Ontario right into the center of the state.
And of course, the older hams will remember that there were no mobile telephone or cellular phone service in those days, right? So being able to talk to your friends in the car, full duplex or half duplex, was actually a pretty cool thing.
It was a pretty cool thing. And I think the other cool thing of the day wasn't that unusual to get your hands on surplus equipment. And I mean, if you were building a repeater, you probably wanted to get your hands on something commercial, a GE Prodline Master or some Motorola equipment, make yourself a pretty decent repeater. But when it came to UHF, even in Toronto, the access to ham-specific commercially built stuff Yaesu, ICOM, Kenwood. It was a little more difficult to put your hands on and a little more expensive. We found that a fair amount of equipment come into the marketplace, surplus marketplace from the telco. Old Motorola MOCOM 70s and MOCOM 35s, which were fun to convert for UHF mobile use. So another interesting aspect of the hobby was, what could you do to take a piece of commercial equipment and make it functional on the ham bands?
I think that's one of the things I miss is the availability of commercial equipment these days. I myself had a GE Master Pro in the car with a duplexer on it.
Wow.
That was very cool on UHF because then you could hear yourself coming back, and when you're talking on the auto patch, you could hear your girlfriend talk and you could interrupt or she could interrupt you. So those were cool times, and the equipment was relatively cheap and there was a lot of it.
Yeah, we actually going back to my younger years at home, one of my first pieces of 2-meter equipment was a surplus Motorola 43G that had been removed from the Metropolitan Toronto Police Force. They had yanked all of these radios out to replace them with newer technology, and they were all put at a moving and storage warehouse and then eventually released to amateurs at no cost. So I wound up with one of those, and fortunately, it wasn't something that was going to be easy. You had a control head, you had a cable, and you had the chassis that was all tubed. And the one I picked up had a T-Power power supply, some big heat sink, and some transistors on it. And what I learned from my mentor was you'll never find a 12-volt power supply big enough to run that. It'll be a big chore. So what we're going to do here is we're going to eliminate the 12-volt power supply. We're going to tear out that heat sink. You can use those transistors for something else and build yourself a high-voltage DC power supply to run the tubes. Get an old cake pan from your mom, and we'll get a piece of aluminum riveted on the top. And it's exactly what I did. I wound up building a power supply, a high-voltage DC power supply for it.
If you ever get that radio back, I have the test set for that.
I had the test set as well, and I can't remember how I came upon it, but it was released from the railway. So it was a lot better than what I had to do. That plastic calculator stand, a 50 microamp meter movement, and I'd have to put that into the test socket in the strips in that 43G for a long time. I use that to net the discriminator, and what else did I do? Oh yeah, take some old tubes, break the glass, take the pins out of the bottom, so that I could get rid of the crystal heater, the crystal elements, and plug the crystals directly into the socket. I mean, who needs a heater if your rig is in a nice warm basement? And you had some extra pins in that socket. You could hook up a switch and have 3 or 4, 5, 6 channels instead of just the 2 that it came with.
That's right. Well, the T43 GGT, which is the radio that you're describing, was my first mobile in my car. And what I wouldn't give for one of those control heads today, just to have that in my car hooked up to something, I don't know, maybe a Raspberry Pi, but it brings back some great memories. That's really cool stuff. How did your ham radio life then proceed from there? You said that, well, before we started talking, that obviously you're transitioning into adulthood as an amateur radio operator. How did that play out? Employment
took a toll on the hobby eventually. So I moved once again from, I think we left off chatting about working for the railway, and then I moved on to a company that manufactured, at the time, video conferencing equipment, which was quite leading edge, and we did a lot of work for banks in Canada and advertising agencies. was pretty fascinating stuff. I traveled a fair bit, and I worked some pretty extensive hours. I was starting to look at settling down and raising a family. So the hobby went on the back burner for a while. Then I eventually moved off to work for Bell in the telephone industry, following to an extent in my father's footsteps. And it was a few years before I was able to really get back and enjoy the hobby once again.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. And so now you're back. One of the reasons that we're speaking is that you were one of the speakers at the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, and you actually did a presentation for Flex Radio operating 100 watts and less, and a wire, which is, obviously we have a very popular podcast named 100 Watts and a Wire, but you were actually showing that you could actually build a station that was 100 watts and less and actually make it work. So if I asked you what the rig is, you could say that you've got a Flex Radio rig?
Yeah, I have a Flex 6600. When I started the new QTH, the rig was a 6300.
Was there a reason that you chose a Flex Radio over any of the other brands in terms of what you wanted to achieve?
Well, let's roll back a little bit. I'm in our current QTH. We're about an hour north of Toronto. We're back in a house. For 8 years prior to that, my wife and I lived in a high-rise condominium in Toronto. Largely employment-based decision, because my wife traveled a fair amount, and that employment took her into the U.S., so proximity to the airport was important. My team worked in the GTA or Greater Toronto area as well, so the decision once the kids had flown the coop was we'll set up in a condominium. We don't need to have the house where we were. We don't need the upkeep or the maintenance. So in there we went, but after Mike and I chatted a little bit, I was bitten by the bug once again. I bought an FT818, went out, did some park operating in local parks. I didn't do any parks on the air stuff. It was just throw a random wire up and a tuner and do some QRP work. I stumbled across the Mississauga Amateur Radio Club, V3MIS. I joined with them. Became interested in operating from their station, very nicely appointed station at the time. Learned that the DAC group had an interest in remote operation, and started to look at ways that I could contribute to that with some of the other club members. What we eventually wound up doing is purchasing a 6600 for the club station, building out some automation and IP infrastructure so that we could access it remotely. And it's kind of the introduction to Flex for me, and ultimately was an influence on me purchasing a 6300 for the station here when we moved to the house.
Now, I'm going to advise the listeners that they can watch your presentation at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website. So they'll get the details about what the station was that you built and how you built it. But let's go to the Mississauga Amateur Radio Club and its remote station. The amateur radio club that you belong to has property and a building and a place to put a ham radio station?
Through the generosity of the building owner, who's also a ham, and he's not licensed in Canada, interestingly enough. He's a Polish fellow. We have access to the second floor of his commercial facility, and that second floor provides us with space to do some meeting. It has an opportunity for us to store club gear. It has workbench space, and importantly, it has a nice shack, heated, air-conditioned, nicely finished. And key to all of this is the ability to put up a couple of towers and some antennas on the roof. So, Jerry, thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. So he provides this space for the amateur radio club. And as you just said, the club station is it all remotely controlled, or is there a portion of the station that's remotely controlled?
We are at a point now where everything at the station can be remotely controlled. So we operate from 80 through 10 on HF, and 6 through 432, and that includes 222. All of that's remote. And we operate 432 and 144 EME remotely from there as well.
How do club members allocate time so that they can work the station without interference or colliding schedules? How does that work?
That's actually a little easier than some might think it to be. We have a station committee, and essentially if you wish to operate, simply drop an email or a message and let one of the station committee members know that you're interested in operating, and we'll make sure that someone else's schedule isn't colliding or interfering with yours. A lot of the activity for the station recently, because of the pandemic and the restrictions here in Ontario, have had us operating remotely. And that's worked out fine, even during contests.
How large is the club now in terms of its membership?
A good question. I wish I could answer it officially as being a club membership manager, but I'm not. I'll say that I expect that we have about 175 members.
And has the numbers increased because of remote meetings? Because of COVID, have you been able to attract people to come into a remote virtual meeting rather than coming to a physical meeting?
It has, Eric, and we do have a couple of fabulous teachers for our Introduction to Ham Radio program that leads those folks who are interested in the hobby through education and Elmering to the point where they can go off and write their ticket. So over the course of the past couple of years, we've seen the membership of the club increase as a result. In spite of the fact that you might not be able to get out and demonstrate the hobby in person, perhaps from a public service event or from field day, the club's been very successful in attracting prospective hams and new members.
How does the club reach out to younger potential hams?
A lot of this is done through social media, and of course, some of this social media exposure is quite good in youth because it's shared rather quickly and rather broadly.
What's the age of your youngest ham in your club? Do you have any idea?
I believe we have an interested prospective ham who's as young as 11 years old. And
what is his interest or her interest?
I think at this point in time, the interest for many of these prospective amateurs is the ability to chat with somebody is an attractive thing, but also the fact that you can make something, you can fab up something, you can modify something. So in terms of the appeal of being able to chat with somebody else, hey, you know what, I can pick up my cell phone and do that. So there's certainly an element of that they understand, but I think more to the point, there's something that I can do to create that ability to chat with someone else. That's my take on it.
Now, You had mentioned at the very beginning that the support that you had for after the Jamboree on the Air came from a teacher who was involved in the industrial arts side of the school at the beginning. The question is, do students in Canada, do they have access to those programs now? I know that in many schools across America, here in Israel, there aren't any schools that have industrial arts programs or electronics programs or auto shops or anything like that. Do those programs still exist? And do you think that that hunger to be hands-on comes from the fact that those programs may not exist anymore?
It's a good question, and certainly in this part of Canada, we've seen the decline in the skilled trades education and opportunities in our secondary school system. And our province, our communities are desperate for skilled trades, and that platform has disappeared from the education system. It was something that filled a need at a different time, and it was perhaps a different need at that time. And I think to a certain extent, Eric, that ability to put your hands on stuff and create stuff is a driver. And you may have some opportunity to do that perhaps through a robotics lab at school if you're fortunate enough to have that in the curriculum. But a lot of the other stuff, electronics shop, metal shop, electrical shop, those things are legacies.
It's interesting that they're legacies, but it seems to me, at least here, that the industry will pay a premium for people that have those combined skills to be able to solve problems that aren't being solved by the engineers who are now being graduated from schools. They just don't have the experience. So it looks like there could be some niche work available for old people who've had those skills, right? We may never have to retire.
Certainly the value of an education in pure science shouldn't be dismissed, but that applied science education is just something that's absolutely invaluable. You take something from concept to reality, and if you've got a little bit of experience hands-on, I think that concept to reality journey is just a little bit easier, just a little bit quicker, and maybe just a little more creative.
I agree. I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I was actually hired by a German tunneling company here in Israel because I was a ham radio operator, and they knew I had a whole bunch of skill sets that they could leverage to solve problems on the site remotely for them. The ham radio experience and perhaps the hands-on is actually a good thing to have. And it doesn't seem to me that the schools are actually doing this. But I think that you've kind of maybe offered some insight here that perhaps one of the ways that we reach younger people is to provide them with more hands-on opportunities, a chance to get dirty and to solve a problem at the same time. And maybe that problem is a need that they have that goes unfulfilled.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something, Eric. And we see the term very frequently used, maker. To me, that the first time I heard that, it was a bit of a foreign term. What does that mean? And I had visions of 3D printers and robotics and such. And I know the term has been used a little more broadly than that, but that mentality that you can in fact create something yourself that's useful is I think what draws some of the younger folks into the hobby. And I think we have a platform to do that through the education program that the club offers, but also importantly when you get out to community events. This isn't a hobby that's restricted to simply purchasing an appliance and plugging it in and having communication. And if in fact that is something that you're attracted to, it's certainly a possibility. But when we get out to those forums like Jamboree on the Air that's coming up this weekend, showing youth and and people who from the community have shown up to the event that you can do something here, an old piece of wire, some coax, some insulators. You can put up an antenna, and you know what? You can make a more effective antenna if you can find a way to put it into the tree a little bit higher. Oh, you have a drone? What if you modified the drone so that instead of the light flashing on and off, you could actually put some type of grip there where you could release stuff? Could you put the wire up in the tree a little bit higher and perhaps have a little more effective signal? These types of conversations are hopefully taking place and evoking some creativity.
You know what? I think they are. One of the things that I'll remind the listeners is that we now have a library of almost 200 presentations from the 3 past QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. One of the things I love when I'm looking through the catalog is that amateur radio now has an amazing, just from the variety of presentations that include drones, as you say, 3D printing. I think the 3D printing presentations are the most popular if I look at the number of downloads. So there is a lot in the amateur radio hobby that we can talk about that should be able to interest someone or everyone, depending upon how we put it out there. And perhaps, as you say, social media might be the way to kind of put that out there and perhaps gain some interest from younger people. Can I ask you, what do you think, Andy, is the most exciting thing in amateur radio for you?
Wow, it's a tough question. There's a lot in the hobby that excites me, and I really enjoy operating HF, and I really enjoy finding that rare DX. I love finding the DXpedition and being able to do that. And we've referred to it in the past, 100 watts in a wire. That's pretty cool stuff for me. And certainly enjoy the tranquility of putting on a headset and operating CW as well. That's something that's still pretty exciting for me.
You have a simple wire antenna on your house, right, with your 100 watts?
That's right.
You're being very successful with that combination.
I'd like to think it's all the antenna, but I'm sure it's a combination of a number of things. You know, certainly my skill at assembling an off-center fed dipole, but I think our location lends itself well. I've got a great rig. I'm very pleased with the Flex 6600. It hears quite nicely. Been quite successful with that for sure, and I have a 15-meter dipole up. The past 2 weeks on 15 meters has been quite rewarding as well.
I interrupted you in terms of being excited. Are there other things that excite you about amateur radio?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to Mike VA3MW and me. Constantly, you should try this, you should do this. So Mike and I have been busy over the past couple of years messing with Node Red for remote station operation and automation. And I told Mike I said eventually I'll have to get a tower up here, but in the meantime I've got an old A50 -3, a 3-element 50 meg antenna. I do operate 6 meters a fair bit. This location's pretty good for it, and sporadic E season was quite rewarding. But now we're going to move into the winter months, and maybe the odd meteor shower, but it's not going to be that much activity. So leaving the antenna pointed in one direction is going to be a bit of a problem. Mike handed me a box of rotor parts and said, "Here, see what you can put together." So mechanically speaking, there was something interesting to do, rebuild the rotor from a pile of parts. But what really got me interested was, here I got this K3NG Arduino controller. I haven't really worked with it at all, but see what you can do with it and let me know. So I've managed to put that together, get rid of the old ham-M controller that went with the rotor, and basically integrated that into the station. But just that exposure to the Arduino was, I think I need to learn a little bit more about that. It's wonderful that the code's all loaded in the box, or pardon me, on the Arduino Nano. That's super. The remote QTH guys have come up with a nice package for it. I like that, but now I want to customize it. Now I want to have it do some other stuff. I think I better learn about coding for that, and was pleasantly surprised at how easy it is to sketch up and load up stuff. So I think that'll be another project, and that'll be something I push towards Mike and say, it's time for you to dig into this as well.
Do you have a ham radio workbench?
I do, yes.
What is your most cherished piece of test equipment on your workbench?
Ooh, that's a good question. Two things that are super important. This is soldering iron. And I just recently retired an old pencil iron and went with a nice new digital Weller soldering station. Not a piece of test equipment, but something that always has to be on the bench, and a really, really decent DMM. And I think up until recently I had an old Fluke 8080A DMM that I had to retire. It was a fixture there, but it eventually died. So in terms of test equipment, that was really the end of it. I have an old Tektronix scope, an old 60 meg scope that gets used periodically. I've got some older test equipment too, VTVM tucked away, and an old Heathkit signal tracer. I don't dare turn those things on without getting the Variac out.
Yeah, just to make sure that it doesn't smoke when you first plug it in. I would think of the signal tracer, you probably just have to replace all the electrolytic caps in it.
Yeah, that's something I have to constantly remind myself as I walk through flea markets and see some stuff from the past. It's like, yeah, you could probably bring that up on a Variac, but you're still going to be disappointed. Anything that you'd like to take off that bench and bring it home and be prepared to recap it.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, I think one of the important things is exposing yourself, particularly if you're returning to the hobby, as I did. Expose yourself to what's going on. I mean, a lot changes in the hobby, a lot changes in technology in even 5 or 10 years. You know what? Join your local club, support your local club, become active. If you can, invest in a membership in your National Radio Society, Radio Amateurs of Canada here, RAC, or ARRL. I've joined both of them. They produce some really good material in terms of digital that you consume on a, if you will, snackable basis weekly. Get the magazines, read up. Watch the videos, get into the podcasts, find out what's going on. The hobby has become so broad. There may just be a facet of the hobby that you've never explored before that was around, or it's a new facet. And I'll point back to this Arduino stuff. Seems pretty cool to me. Yeah, I've done some stuff on Raspberry Pis before. I'm fairly comfortable with Linux, but wow, I can envision doing some cool stuff with that. So it's another facet of the hobby. It supports to an extent what I want to do. So ultimately, what do I want to do? I'd like to get on the air and work DX, do some CW work. I'd like to keep the gear outside of the shack and office, which isn't quite complete yet, and it kind of connects together and says, you know what, use that stuff to support what you want to do. I want a remote operation. I want to automate stuff. I can have some fun doing that, and you know what, I can I can create it. I can build it my way.
It's not your old man's ham radio anymore, is it?
No, it's not your old man's ham radio. It certainly isn't. A box of tubes and some transformers and some discrete components and a workbench.
Right, in 2 modes.
In 2 modes.
Now we have 1,000 modes of various kinds. Andy, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was fun. When I speak to Canadians, I always learn something new, and oftentimes in email I have to apologize to Canadians that write to me that are surprised by my lack of knowledge about Canada. I think that probably that's my American education. It was deficient in Canadian history, so I always give my apologies up front to the Canadians that listen to the show. But I've learned so much, and I've enjoyed it so much, and I want to thank you for coming on the QSO Today podcast.
Eric, thank you for having me into the discussion. I really enjoyed it, and contrary to what you said, I think you have a reasonably good handle for your couple of visits to Canada on what's going on north of the 49th, so to speak. And lots of fun. You know what? Lots of reminiscing here that I will cherish for a few days as I walk away from this and go, I haven't thought about that for quite some time. So I really enjoyed it too. Thanks, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Andy. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in Victor Alpha 3 Charlie Whiskey in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.